15% of American men report having no close friends, up from 3% in 1990, a fivefold increase in 3 decades, according to the Survey Center on American Life. In 1990, 55% of men said they had 6 or more close friends. By 2021, that number had fallen to 27%. Only 15% of men now describe themselves as having 10 or more close friends, down from 40% in 1990. Women's numbers fell too, but by a smaller margin, 11% reporting 10 or more close friends today, down from 17%. Men aged 50 to 64 reported the easiest pandemic year of any demographic group studied. Only 14% called it much harder than usual, compared to 27% of women, and 43% said the year felt no different than any other. Membership in fraternal organizations like the Elks and the Rotary Club has dropped roughly 80% since 1970. Attendance at Rotary and Kiwanis meetings fell 58% between 1975 and 2000 alone. Bowling league participation has dropped by a similar margin since 1980, even as bowling itself stayed popular. Daily time spent maintaining friendships by middle age has fallen to roughly 30 minutes, according to the American Enterprise Institute's analysis of the same survey data. The U.S. Surgeon General's 2023 advisory found that chronic social disconnection carries a mortality risk comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and that prolonged loneliness raises the risk of premature death by 26%, the risk of stroke by 32%, and the risk of heart disease by 29%. Men report receiving emotional support from a friend in the past week at less than half the rate women do, 21% versus 41%. None of this shows up on a chart. Men in their 50s are shown. It shows up nowhere because nobody is measuring it in real time, and by the time it's visible in the data, the friendships are already gone. What the numbers describe is not a personality trait. It is a structural collapse with a beginning, a middle, and a documented endpoint, and the man living through it rarely has the vocabulary to name what's missing, because the culture never gave him one. Start with the beginning because the research on where this starts is uncomfortable. NYU developmental psychologist Niobe Way spent 2 decades interviewing adolescent boys for her book Deep Secrets, and what she found contradicts almost everything assumed about male emotional life. Teenage boys, in their own words, describe their closest friendships in the language of romance: necessary, intimate, the thing that kept them from going wacko without it. Boys in early and middle adolescence were not emotionally stunted. They were attached, articulate, and dependent on each other in ways that looked nothing like the stereotype. Then, by late adolescence, that closeness collapsed, not gradually but as a kind of forced renunciation, driven by the demand to prove manhood through independence, stoicism, and distance from anything coded as feminine or gay. Way's subjects didn't drift away from their closest friends. They were taught to let go of them on purpose, and to call the letting go maturity. That's the seed. The next 3 decades water it. The historical parallel is not subtle once it's named. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote in the 1830s that America's strength was its density of voluntary association. Men joined lodges, unions, fraternal orders, churches, civic clubs, and those memberships were not incidental to friendship. They were its delivery mechanism. Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, published in 2000, traced what happened to that infrastructure after the 1960s. Civic and fraternal participation fell across nearly every category he measured, and the decline wasn't evenly distributed. It fell hardest on exactly the institutions that had functioned for generations of men, as a substitute for emotional language, the lodge meeting where you didn't have to say you needed people because showing up was the saying. Here is the complication, because the story is not simply men used to have community and lost it. Many of those institutions were also exclusionary, frequently by design. For 100 years, one prominent social club in this research excluded Jews and minorities regardless of merit, and excluded women for 123 years. The infrastructure being mourned was real, but it was also narrow, and its decline cannot be cleanly separated from the broader unraveling of an order that excluded as a condition of including. The nostalgia for the lodge has to hold both facts at once, or it isn't honest. The decline also has a geography, and the geography is mundane in a way that makes it easy to miss. Urban sociologist Ray Oldenburg, who coined the term third place in his 1989 book The Great Good Place, argued that post-war suburban development didn't just rearrange where Americans lived, it eliminated the physical settings where casual, low-stakes male contact used to happen by default. The corner bar, the barbershop, the diner counter, the union hall within walking distance, all replaced by a commute structure Oldenburg called the home-to-work and back-again shuttle. Zoning laws separated residential, commercial, and civic space into distinct zones, which meant the spontaneous, no-agenda contact that used to produce friendship as a byproduct of just being somewhere had no remaining venue to occur in. Friendship stopped being a thing that happened to men incidentally, while they were doing something else. It became a thing that had to be scheduled on purpose against competing claims on the calendar, and scheduling on purpose against competing claims is exactly the skill the culture never taught men to practice because for 2 centuries they didn't have to. What replaced the lodge structurally was the marriage. Sociologist Matthias Kalman's research on retirement transitions found that men lose more friends than women do when they leave the workforce, and that they compensate by relying on their wives as social brokers, the people who remember the names, plan the dinners, keep the relationships alive on their behalf. Subsequent research on married couples found a measurable pattern. Husbands, but not wives, experience a documented decline in the proportion of their own friends within the shared network after marriage, a trait absorbed quietly and rarely discussed. The friendships didn't end in a single moment. They were handed over, piece by piece, to someone else's calendar. This dependency only becomes visible once the broker is gone, and the data on what happens next is specific. Researchers Terhel, Breeze van Gronu, and Van Tilburg followed divorced adults using longitudinal data collected from the late 1980s and found that 50% of men and women lost friendships in the divorce itself, and 12 years later, those friendships still had not been replaced for a meaningful share of them. Not delayed. Not recovered with time. Simply gone, permanently, from a single event most people experience as a marital failure rather than a social one. Widowhood follows a related but distinct pattern. Research using the German Aging Survey found that social networks actually expand for several years after a spouse's death, as the bereaved mobilize new ties to compensate. But that expansion peaks around the 4th year and decays back toward pre-widowhood levels by year 7, and the recovery is least durable for the widowed who lack a university degree, and for men more than women. The mechanism that was supposed to soften the loss has its own expiration date, and almost nobody going through it knows that in advance. Quick aside, because this is the part that should stop a viewer mid-scroll. Somewhere in his late 40s, a man can lose his closest friend without an event, an argument, or a funeral, through sheer accumulated absence, and not notice until the funeral is real and there's no one left who remembers who he was at 25. There's a cognitive cost buried in this too, one that rarely makes it into the popular coverage. Research drawing on the Health and Retirement Study, tracking adults 50 and older from 2006 through 2018, found that friendship strain, not friendship absence, but active conflict or disappointment within the friendships that do exist, predicted faster cognitive decline specifically among widowed men, a pattern the same data did not show for widowed women. The friendships men have left in late middle age are not neutral. A bad one appears to cost more than a good one gives back, and the people most exposed to that asymmetry are the ones with the fewest friendships left to absorb the loss of a bad one. The men currently in their 50s are the first cohort to experience this collapse end-to-end, fully documented, fully aged into. They were adolescents when Way's research subjects were losing intimate friendship on schedule. They were young men when Putnam's institutions were already in steep decline. They married into the broker model in their 30s and 40s, often without recognizing what they were outsourcing. Now their children are leaving, their parents are dying or already gone, and the social infrastructure they were promised, the one that was supposed to exist by now on the other side of career and family obligation, was never built because nobody is incentivized to build it. There's no institution whose job is producing close adult male friendship. There used to be a flawed one. Now there's a void with the same shape. If this is starting to sound familiar, it might be worth asking who in your life is doing the social work you've stopped noticing gets done. There's a theoretical frame in gerontology that explains why this particular decade lands so hard. Socioemotional selectivity theory, developed by psychologist Laura Carstensen, holds that as people age, they deliberately narrow their social circles toward the relationships that matter most emotionally and let the peripheral ones lapse. A healthy, adaptive process under normal conditions, because it concentrates limited time on higher quality connection. The complication is that the theory assumes a baseline circle wide enough to narrow from. Carstensen's model describes curation. What's been documented in men since 1990 looks more like attrition that started before the curation could begin, which means a man in his 50s evaluating his shrunken social world through that adaptive, this is supposed to happen lens may be reassuring himself with a theory that doesn't actually apply to his case. This is where the data gets genuinely unresolved, and a credible account has to admit it. There is real disagreement among researchers about how much of this is decline versus how much is a measurement artifact. Pew's 2023 polling, using a broader definition of friendship than the 2021 Survey Center study, found the gender gap nearly closed. 9% of men with no close friends compared to 8% of women, both reporting roughly 5 close friends on average. If that finding holds, the male friendship recession headline overstates a gap that's mostly converged, and the real story is a general decline in adult friendship that hits men only slightly harder than everyone else. The original frame still does real work, though, because even Pew's own data shows men remain less satisfied with what they have and less likely to get emotional, as opposed to merely social support from the friends they do report. The quantity gap may be closing. The function gap, what the friendship is actually for, shows no comparable sign of closing, and that distinction is where the actual grief lives. Grief researchers have a term for loss that doesn't get social recognition: disenfranchised grief, typically applied to ex-spouses, estranged family, or relationships society doesn't validate as loss-worthy. A man in his 50s who has lost the capacity for the kind of friendship he had at 17 fits the definition almost exactly. There's no ritual for it. No one sends a card. He can't tell his wife he misses being known the way his college roommate knew him because it sounds like an accusation, and he can't tell his friends because the friends who'd understand are the ones he's grieving the loss of access to. The grief has nowhere to go. It doesn't disappear. It just stops being discussed, which is, by most accounts of how suppressed emotion behaves, the worst possible place for it to sit. Stick around, the next video is about what happens to that same grief when it shows up disguised as midlife anger instead of midlife sadness, and why almost nobody around these men is trained to tell the difference. What the data points toward, finally, is not a crisis with a clean solution and not a panic without a basis. It's a generation of men carrying a specific, dateable, structurally produced loss that nobody taught them to recognize as loss. Some of it will resolve as definitions catch up to reality. Some of it won't, because the institutions that once delivered male friendship without requiring vulnerability as the price of admission are not coming back, and nothing has yet replaced their function. What remains unknown is whether men in their 50s right now still have time to build something different, or whether the capacity we found intact in 14-year-olds is something that, once spent, doesn't fully return. If you want more videos like this,